Isabella Torres never imagined that standing in formation at Fort Meridian would lead to the most humiliating and ultimately triumphant moment of her military career. What started as routine integration training would end with her uniform torn from her body in front of hundreds of soldiers, only for a hidden tattoo to make every general in the facility drop to their knees in respect. But to understand how a quiet veteran became the most powerful woman on base in a single afternoon, we need to go back to where it all began. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Isabella Torres stood at the edge of the blazing Arizona desert, watching the sun rise over Fort Meridian Training Complex like a furnace being lit for the day. At 32 years old, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen too much but refused to let it break her. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, not a strand out of place, and her uniform was pressed to perfection despite the early hour. But there was something different about Isabella that set her apart from every other soldier on the base, something that would soon change everything. She was part of the Veteran Reintegration Program, an initiative designed to help former military personnel transition back into active service after extended leave. For Isabella, this wasn't about getting back into the military. It was about proving she still belonged there. 3 years ago, she had walked away from everything she'd ever known, carrying secrets that weighed heavier than any pack she had ever shouldered in combat. Now she was back, and everyone seemed determined to remind her that she didn't fit in anymore. The other participants in the program were mostly younger soldiers, fresh-faced recruits who looked at Isabella like she was a relic from a different era. At 32, she was nearly a decade older than most of them, and her quiet demeanor made her an easy target for whispered conversations and sideways glances. They saw a woman who kept to herself, who didn't laugh at their jokes, who seemed to take everything too seriously. What they didn't see was the reason why. Fort Meridian was one of the most prestigious training facilities in the country, known for producing elite soldiers who went on to serve in the most classified operations the military had to offer. The reintegration program was competitive. Only a handful of veterans were selected each year, and the screening process was more rigorous than most special forces selections. Isabella had applied quietly, without fanfare, and somehow her paperwork had been approved despite missing several standard documentation requirements that would normally disqualify a candidate. The program director, a stern-faced colonel named Diana Stone, had briefed the group on their first day about the expectations and standards they would be held to. Quote, "This facility has a reputation for excellence," quote, Stone had announced to the assembled veterans. End quote. "You are here because someone believes you have the potential to contribute to that excellence. Don't prove them wrong." Isabella had listened to those words with the same neutral expression she wore for everything else, but inside she felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She knew exactly why she was here, and it had nothing to do with reintegration. There were things happening in the world, classified things, that required her specific set of skills. The reintegration program was just a cover, a way to get her back into the system without raising questions about why a veteran with her particular background was suddenly needed again. But the other soldiers didn't know any of that. All they saw was a quiet woman who seemed out of place among the aggressive, competitive atmosphere at Fort Meridian. During physical training, Isabella performed every exercise with mechanical precision, never struggling, never complaining, but also never standing out. She completed obstacle courses with the fluid efficiency of someone who had run similar courses 1,000 times before. But she did it quietly, without the grunting and shouting that most soldiers use to push through difficult moments. Her living quarters were Spartanly organized, military-issued bedding made with hospital corners, personal items arranged with geometric precision, and a small collection of books that suggested someone who spent her free time studying rather than socializing.
The isolation wasn't entirely by choice. Isabella carried the weight of experiences that she couldn't share with anyone who lacked the proper security clearance. There were nights when she woke up in a cold sweat, not from nightmares about combat, but from memories of missions that officially never happened. She had learned to compartmentalize those experiences, to lock them away in a part of her mind that couldn't interfere with her daily functioning. But the isolation that compartmentalization required made it difficult to form the casual friendships that made military life bearable for most soldiers. The instructors at Fort Meridian had mixed opinions about Isabella. Some recognized the signs of an experienced operator, the way she moved with unconscious situational awareness, how she could field strip and reassemble weapons with her eyes closed, her ability to navigate complex tactical scenarios without hesitation. But others saw only what appeared on the surface, a veteran who seemed disconnected from the aggressive, competitive culture that defined elite military training. Captain Vincent Harper was firmly in the second camp. Harper was a rising star in the military hierarchy, a man who had built his reputation on identifying and eliminating weak links before they could compromise unit effectiveness. At 35, he was young for his rank, with the kind of polished appearance and confident demeanor that suggested he was destined for bigger things. He had been watching Isabella for weeks, and everything about her screamed red flag to him. Harper saw Isabella's quiet demeanor as weakness, her lack of aggressive posturing as evidence that she couldn't handle the pressure of elite military operations. He had built his career on making hard decisions about personnel, and everything about Isabella suggested she was someone who would crack under pressure when it mattered most. The fact that her paperwork seemed to have some irregularities only confirmed his suspicions that she was there through some kind of political favor rather than merit. During group exercises, Harper would position himself where he could observe Isabella's performance, looking for evidence to support his growing conviction that she didn't belong at Fort Meridian. He watched her during combat simulations, during tactical planning sessions, during physical training, always waiting for her to reveal the weakness he was certain existed beneath her composed exterior. What Harper didn't realize was that Isabella was watching him too. She had encountered officers like Harper before, competent enough to advance in peacetime, but lacking the experience and judgment that came from actual combat operations. She recognized his type, someone who confused aggressive posturing with leadership, who mistook volume for authority. In her experience, officers like Harper were dangerous because they made decisions based on assumptions rather than evidence. But Isabella kept her observations to herself. She was here for a reason that had nothing to do with proving herself to Captain Harper or anyone else at Fort Meridian. Her mission, the real reason she had returned to active duty, required her to maintain a low profile until the time came to act. The reintegration program was just a cover story, a way to position her where she needed to be when the call came.
As the weeks passed, the dynamic between Isabella and the other soldiers began to shift in subtle ways. Her consistent performance and quiet competence started to stand out among the more volatile personalities in the program. While other veterans struggled with the transition back to military life, Isabella adapted seamlessly, as if she had never really left. Her equipment was always perfect, her performance always consistent, her demeanor always professional. This consistency began to make some people uncomfortable. In a culture that valued aggressive self-promotion and competitive displays of strength, Isabella's quiet confidence felt almost like a rebuke. She didn't need to prove herself through loud demonstrations or confrontational behavior, and that made people wonder what she was hiding. The questions about Isabella's background became more persistent as time went on. Her fellow veterans tried to draw her out with war stories and shared experiences, but Isabella deflected these conversations with practiced skill. She would listen politely, nod at appropriate moments, but never contribute details about her own service. When pressed, she would simply say that her previous assignments were classified and change the subject. This evasiveness only fueled more speculation. Some soldiers began to wonder if Isabella had seen combat at all, or if her claims of classified service were just a way to avoid admitting that her military experience had been less dramatic than she wanted people to believe. The whispers and sideways glances became more frequent, and Isabella found herself increasingly isolated from the group. But isolation was something Isabella had learned to handle long ago. She had spent months alone in hostile territory, had operated for weeks without backup or support, had made decisions that affected national security while cut off from all communication with command. The social dynamics of a training facility were nothing compared to the psychological pressure of real combat operations. As the sun climbed higher over Fort Meridian, casting harsh shadows across the desert training grounds, Isabella prepared for what she knew would be another day of careful observation and quiet endurance. She had no way of knowing that this particular day would end with her standing before every high-ranking officer in the facility, or that the secrets she had worked so hard to protect were about to be revealed in the most dramatic way possible. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would change everything, and Isabella Torres was about to discover that sometimes the best way to hide in plain sight is to let people underestimate you until the moment comes to prove them wrong.
The mess hall at Fort Meridian buzzed with the usual morning energy. Soldiers grabbing coffee, comparing notes from the previous day's training, and preparing mentally for whatever challenges lay ahead. Isabella Torres moved through the breakfast line with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else, selecting her meal based on nutritional requirements rather than preference. She found an empty table near the back of the hall, opened a technical manual, and began reading while she ate. She had made it exactly 3 pages into a chapter on advanced tactical communications when the familiar sound of whispered conversations began to drift her way. The voices belonged to Sergeant Nicole Pierce and Lieutenant Samantha Fields, 2 soldiers who had made Isabella the subject of their speculation since her first day at the facility. "I'm telling you, there's something off about her," Pierce was saying, not bothering to keep her voice particularly low. Pierce was a compact woman with short blonde hair and the kind of aggressive confidence that came from years of having to prove herself in male-dominated environments. Her uniform was always impeccable, her posture always perfect, and her opinions always delivered with absolute certainty. Fields nodded in agreement, stirring sugar into her coffee with unnecessary force. 3 weeks, and nobody's heard her say more than 10 words at a time? What kind of soldier doesn't have war stories? What kind of veteran doesn't want to talk about their service? Isabella continued reading, her expression never changing, but she was listening to every word. She had learned long ago that people revealed more about themselves when they thought you weren't paying attention than they ever did in direct conversation. Pierce and Fields were performing for each other, each trying to appear more insightful and perceptive than the other. "Maybe she never saw real action," Pierce suggested, leaning forward conspiratorially. "Maybe she was one of those desk jockeys who spent her whole service pushing papers, and now she's trying to reinvent herself as some kind of operator." Fields laughed, a sound that carried more malice than humor. "That would explain why she's so quiet about her background. Hard to make up stories about combat when you've never been closer to danger than a paper cut." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Corporal Ryan Nash, a stocky soldier with arms covered in military tattoos who had appointed himself as the unofficial leader of the younger veterans in the program. Nash had the kind of aggressive masculinity that demanded constant validation, and he had been looking for ways to establish dominance over the group since day 1. "Are we talking about the Ice Queen again?" Nash asked, sliding into the seat next to Pierce. He didn't bother to lower his voice, and several nearby tables turned to listen. "I've been watching her during PT, and something's definitely weird about her technique." Isabella turned a page in her manual, her fingers steady despite the increasing volume of the conversation. She had faced interrogations by hostile forces who were trying to extract classified information from her. A few insecure soldiers gossiping over breakfast hardly registered as a threat. "What do you mean?" Fields asked, genuinely curious now. Nash gestured toward Isabella's table with his coffee cup. "Watch her during combat drills. She moves like she's following a checklist instead of reacting to the situation. Everything's too perfect, too rehearsed, like she learned it all from a manual instead of real experience." Pierce nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. I noticed the same thing during yesterday's urban warfare simulation. She cleared that building like she was following a script, not like someone who'd actually done it before under fire."
What they didn't understand, what they couldn't possibly know, was that Isabella's movements were so smooth and automatic precisely because she had done it before, dozens of times, in real combat situations where mistakes meant death. The rehearsed quality they were observing was the result of muscle memory developed through years of the most elite training the military had to offer, followed by practical application in classified operations these soldiers would never hear about. But their ignorance emboldened them. Nash leaned back in his chair, speaking loudly enough for half the mess hall to hear. "I bet she's never even been deployed. Probably spent her whole service stateside, maybe did some training exercises, and now she's trying to play with the big kids." The comment drew chuckles from several nearby tables. Other soldiers were starting to pay attention to the conversation, drawn by the entertainment value of watching someone get torn down. In military culture, pecking orders were established through displays of dominance, and Nash was clearly positioning himself above Isabella in the hierarchy. Isabella closed her manual and stood up to bus her tray. As she walked past their table, she could feel their eyes following her, measuring her reaction, looking for signs of weakness or vulnerability. But Isabella had learned long ago not to react to provocations from people who couldn't understand what real strength looked like. "See," Nash said as she passed, "doesn't even defend herself. What kind of soldier doesn't have enough pride to stand up for their record?"
The question hung in the air as Isabella left the mess hall, but it followed her throughout the day. During morning PT, she could hear whispered conversations stopping abruptly when she approached. During tactical exercises, she noticed other soldiers exchanging glances when they thought she wasn't looking. The speculation about her background was becoming a form of entertainment for the group, a way to bond over their shared superiority to the mysterious woman who didn't fit their expectations. The afternoon brought combat training in the facility's Urban Warfare Simulation Center, a series of interconnected buildings designed to replicate the challenges of fighting in civilian environments. The exercise was designed to test individual problem-solving skills under pressure, with each soldier navigating through the course alone while instructors observed and evaluated their performance. Isabella was assigned to run the course third, after Pierce and Nash had completed their runs. She watched their performances from the observation deck, noting their techniques, their decision-making processes, their tactical approaches. Both soldiers were competent, displaying the kind of aggressive, direct methods that worked well in training environments, but might prove problematic in real-world situations where collateral damage and civilian casualties were considerations. When her turn came, Isabella descended to the starting position and waited for the signal to begin. The scenario was complex, a hostage situation in a multi-story building with unknown numbers of hostile forces and civilian bystanders. Success would be measured not just on completion time, but on tactical soundness, safety protocols, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. The signal came, and Isabella moved into the building with a fluidity that was immediately noticeable to everyone watching. Where Pierce and Nash had advanced with obvious caution, announcing their presence with heavy footsteps and unnecessary noise, Isabella seemed to glide through the space like smoke. Her weapon positioning was perfect, her room-clearing technique flawless, her movement between cover points so smooth it looked choreographed. But what really caught the observer's attention was her decision-making. When faced with a scenario that required choosing between speed and safety, Isabella consistently chose the option that would minimize risk to hypothetical civilians, even if it meant taking longer to complete the objective. When confronted with ambiguous targets, she held her fire until she could positively identify threats, displaying the kind of fire discipline that only came from real-world experience where wrong decisions had permanent consequences. She completed the course in record time while maintaining perfect safety protocols, but instead of celebrating her performance, the watching soldiers found new reasons to criticize her. Nash was the first to speak up as Isabella emerged from the course. "That was too easy for her," he announced to the group, like she'd run that exact scenario before. "Makes you wonder if someone gave her advanced knowledge of the course layout." Pierce nodded in agreement. "No one moves that smoothly through an urban environment without practice. Lots of practice. More practice than you'd get in normal training." The implication was clear. They were suggesting that Isabella had somehow cheated, that her superior performance was the result of unfair advantage rather than genuine skill. It was a common defense mechanism among soldiers who couldn't accept that someone they'd dismissed as weak might actually be more capable than they were. Fields joined the conversation, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they want to sound reasonable while making unreasonable accusations. I'm not saying she definitely cheated, but you have to admit her performance was suspiciously perfect. Real soldiers make mistakes under pressure. Real soldiers have to adapt to unexpected situations. Isabella listened to their theories with the same neutral expression she wore for everything else. But inside, she was evaluating each speaker with the cold assessment she reserved for potential threats. These soldiers were revealing more about their own limitations than they realized. Their inability to recognize genuine competence, their need to tear down anyone who challenged their sense of superiority, their willingness to make accusations without evidence. As the day wore on, the whispered conversations became more frequent and more pointed. Isabella found herself increasingly isolated, eating alone, training alone, spending her free time in her quarters while other soldiers bonded over their shared certainty that she didn't belong among them. But isolation was something Isabella had learned to value. In her quarters that evening, she opened a locked case and withdrew a small, encrypted communication device. The message she sent was brief and coded, but its meaning was clear to the recipient. She was in position, maintaining cover, and ready to proceed when the time came. The soldiers at Fort Meridian thought they were dealing with a pretender, someone trying to fake her way through elite training. What they didn't realize was that they were living and working alongside an operative whose real background made their most impressive accomplishments look like children's games. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for her critics to voice their doubts, and new tests of Isabella's ability to maintain her cover while surrounded by people who were determined to prove she didn't belong among them. But isolation was something Isabella had learned to value. The real test would come when her cover was blown and everyone discovered exactly who they had been dismissing as weak and unqualified. When that moment came, the power dynamics at Fort Meridian would shift in ways that none of them could possibly anticipate.
Captain Vincent Harper stood in his office overlooking the training grounds, watching the morning formation through his window with the calculating gaze of someone who prided himself on reading people. His office was a shrine to his own achievements, commendations covering one wall, photographs from various military ceremonies, and a bookshelf filled with leadership manuals that he quoted regularly but seemed to understand only superficially. At 35, Harper had built his reputation on being a problem solver, someone who could identify weaknesses in personnel before they became operational liabilities. And right now, all of his instincts were telling him that Isabella Torres was a problem waiting to explode. Harper had been watching Isabella for 3 weeks, documenting what he saw as increasingly troubling patterns in her behavior. Her file was spread across his desk, or rather, what little file existed. The paperwork for her admission to the reintegration program was unusually sparse, with several standard documentation requirements mysteriously waived or marked as classified pending review. For a man who believed that proper documentation was the foundation of military order, these gaps represented serious red flags. He picked up his phone and dialed an extension he'd been calling more frequently over the past few days. "Colonel Stone, this is Captain Harper. I think we need to discuss the Torres situation before it gets out of hand." Colonel Diana Stone's voice came through the receiver with the crisp authority of someone who had spent 3 decades managing difficult personnel situations. "What specific concerns do you have, Captain?" Harper settled back in his chair, organizing his thoughts into the kind of systematic presentation that had served him well throughout his career. "Ma'am, I've been observing Torres for 3 weeks now, and I believe we have a serious problem. Her background documentation is incomplete, her behavior is inconsistent with someone of her claimed experience level, and her interaction with other soldiers suggests someone who is hiding something significant." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Stone was weighing his words, considering the implications of what he was suggesting. "Those are serious accusations, Captain. Do you have specific evidence to support your concerns? Harper opened a notebook where he had been documenting his observations. Ma'am, Torres claims extensive combat experience, but her responses to stress situations are too controlled, too perfect. Real combat veterans have trauma responses, unpredictable reactions to certain stimuli. Torres shows none of that. She's either never seen real combat or she's been extensively trained to suppress natural responses in ways that suggest specialized conditioning. The second possibility troubled Harper more than the first. In his experience, soldiers who had been trained to suppress natural stress responses were usually special operations personnel, and special operations personnel didn't end up in reintegration programs without very specific reasons. Either Torres was lying about her background, or she was exactly what she claimed to be, and if she was exactly what she claimed to be, her presence at Fort Meridian raised questions that Harper wasn't qualified to answer. Additionally, Harper continued, her performance metrics are statistically improbable. She completes every exercise with perfect scores, never makes mistakes, never shows fatigue or stress indicators. That level of consistency isn't natural. It suggests either extensive advanced knowledge of our training protocols or capabilities that far exceed what would be expected from someone in a reintegration program. Stone's voice carried a note of caution when she responded, Captain, you're describing someone who might simply be exceptionally well-trained. That's not necessarily a cause for concern. But Harper had built his career on trusting his instincts about people, and every instinct he possessed was screaming that Isabella Torres represented a threat to the good order and discipline of his facility. Ma'am, with respect, I believe Torres is either a fraud or she's operating under false pretenses. Either way, she doesn't belong in this program, and her continued presence is undermining morale and unit cohesion. The morale issue was real enough. Harper had been receiving reports from other soldiers about the growing resentment toward Isabella's perfect performance and mysterious background. Sergeant Pierce had filed an informal complaint about what she perceived as favoritism in Isabella's evaluations. Corporal Nash had suggested that Isabella's presence was creating an unfair competitive environment. Lieutenant Fields had questioned whether Isabella's superior performance might be the result of advanced knowledge of training scenarios. I'm recommending immediate review of Torres's clearance and background documentation. If there are irregularities in her paperwork, they need to be addressed before she compromises operational security. If her background is legitimate but classified above our clearance level, then she shouldn't be in a general reintegration program. Stone's response was measured, professional, and completely unsatisfactory to Harper's sense of urgency. I'll take your concerns under advisement, Captain. Continue your observations and document any specific incidents that support your assessment. Harper hung up the phone feeling like he'd just been dismissed by someone who didn't understand the gravity of the situation. In his experience, military disasters occurred when obvious warning signs were ignored by people who were too concerned with political correctness or bureaucratic procedures to take decisive action.
He walked to his window and watched Isabella moving through morning PT with the same fluid efficiency that had been troubling him for weeks. She completed every exercise with mechanical precision, never struggling, never slowing down, never showing the kind of natural variation that characterized normal human performance. It was like watching a machine disguised as a person. His contemplation was interrupted by a knock on his door. Sergeant Pierce entered after being called, her posture crisp and professional, but Harper could see the frustration in her eyes that she was working hard to control. "Sir, I wanted to follow up on our conversation yesterday about the Torres situation," Pierce began. "The other soldiers are starting to ask questions about why she's being held to different standards than the rest of us." Harper gestured for her to sit down. Pierce was exactly the kind of soldier he preferred to work with.
competent, aggressive, unwilling to accept unfair treatment without protest. Her concerns about Isabella mirrored his own, which confirmed his assessment that the problem was obvious to anyone with proper military judgment. "What specific incidents are you referring to, Sergeant?" Harper asked, though he suspected he already knew the answers. Pierce opened a small notebook of her own. "Yesterday's tactical exercise, sir. Torres completed the urban warfare scenario in record time, with perfect safety protocols. But when I asked the instructor how she managed to navigate the course so efficiently, he said she moved like someone who had extensive experience with that specific type of environment." Harper nodded. It was exactly the kind of detail that supported his growing conviction that Isabella was not what she appeared to be. "Additionally," Pierce continued, "Torres never participates in informal social activities with the other soldiers. She doesn't share war stories, doesn't discuss her previous assignments, doesn't engage in the kind of casual conversation that builds unit cohesion. That level of social isolation is either a sign of serious psychological issues or deliberate deception." The psychological issues angle was one Harper hadn't fully considered, but it made sense. Soldiers with untreated PTSD or other combat-related psychological problems often exhibited exactly the kind of emotional detachment that Isabella displayed. If she was psychologically unfit for duty, her presence in the program represented a danger to herself and others. "Sir," Pierce said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who was about to make a significant suggestion, "I think Torres needs to be confronted directly about her background and qualifications. If she's legitimate, she should be able to provide satisfactory answers to reasonable questions about her service record. If she can't, then we have our answer about whether she belongs here." Harper considered the suggestion. Direct confrontation carried risks. If Isabella was exactly what she claimed to be, challenging her publicly could backfire spectacularly. But if she was a fraud or a security risk, continued tolerance of her presence could lead to much worse consequences. "What do you suggest, Sergeant?" Pierce leaned forward, her expression intense. "Public accountability, sir. If Torres claims to be an elite soldier, she should be able to demonstrate that claim under pressure. Real pressure, not the controlled environment of standard training exercises." The idea appealed to Harper's sense of justice and military order. Elite soldiers earned their status through demonstrated competence under extreme conditions. If Isabella couldn't handle public scrutiny of her capabilities, she had no business claiming elite status. "The other soldiers are watching the situation closely," Pierce continued. "They need to see that competence and integrity are valued over mystery and political connections. If Torres is allowed to continue operating under different standards than everyone else, it undermines the credibility of the entire program." Harper made his decision. Tomorrow's field exercise will provide an appropriate opportunity for Torres to demonstrate her claimed capabilities under appropriate pressure. If she is as competent as her performance suggests she deserves, she should welcome the chance to prove herself publicly. Pierce smiled with satisfaction. "Yes, sir. I think the other soldiers will appreciate seeing this matter resolved definitively." As Pierce left his office, Harper felt the familiar satisfaction that came from taking decisive action to solve a persistent problem. Tomorrow would provide answers to the questions that have been troubling him for weeks. Isabella Torres would either prove herself worthy of the respect her performance suggests she deserves, or she would be exposed as the fraud he increasingly suspected her to be. What Harper didn't realize was that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his military career, one that would end with him facing a court-martial board and Isabella Torres holding a position of authority that would reshape everything he thought he knew about military hierarchy and respect. The confrontation he was planning would indeed provide definitive answers about Isabella's background and capabilities. But those answers would prove to be far more shocking than anything Harper's limited imagination could have anticipated.
The Arizona sun blazed overhead like a malevolent eye as the soldiers of Fort Meridian's reintegration program assembled for what would become the most talked-about field exercise in the facility's history. Isabella Torres stood in formation with the same quiet composure she had maintained for 3 weeks, unaware that she was about to become the center of a public confrontation that would change everything. The exercise was supposed to be a routine evaluation, teams of soldiers working through tactical scenarios designed to test their ability to operate under pressure. But Captain Harper had other plans. He had spent the previous evening coordinating with Sergeant Pierce and Lieutenant Fields, carefully orchestrating what he believed would be a definitive test of Isabella's claimed capabilities. Harper emerged from the command post wearing his dress uniform instead of the standard field gear, a detail that immediately caught the attention of experienced soldiers who recognized the signs of something unusual happening. His bearing was that of a man who had made a significant decision and was prepared to see it through regardless of the consequences. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harper announced, his voice carrying across the assembled formation with the authority of someone who was absolutely certain of his righteousness. "Today's exercise will be modified to include individual performance evaluations under enhanced scrutiny." Isabella felt a subtle shift in the energy around her, the way soldiers unconsciously position themselves when they sense that someone was about to be singled out. She had experienced this feeling before, in hostile territory where being noticed meant being targeted. Her training kicked in automatically. Heightened awareness, controlled breathing, mental preparation for whatever was coming. Harper began walking down the line of soldiers, his eyes scanning each face with theatrical intensity. But everyone knew where this performance was heading. The whispered conversations of the past weeks had created an expectation, a shared understanding that Isabella Torres was about to be put to the test in ways that went beyond normal military evaluation. "Military service is built on trust," Harper continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Trust that every soldier has earned their place through demonstrated competence. Trust that every person wearing the uniform has proven themselves worthy of that honor." He stopped directly in front of Isabella, close enough that she could see the conviction burning in his eyes. Harper was a true believer, someone who genuinely thought he was protecting the integrity of the military by exposing what he saw as a fraud. "But what happens," Harper asked, raising his voice so everyone could hear, "what happens when someone claims credentials they haven't earned, capabilities they don't possess, experiences they never had?" The formation had gone completely silent. Even the instructors who weren't part of Harper's plan had stopped their preparations to watch what was unfolding. Cell phones appeared in hands throughout the crowd, soldiers instinctively recognizing that they were about to witness something that would be talked about for years. Isabella remained at attention, her face showing no reaction to Harper's words. She had been interrogated by hostile forces who were trying to extract classified information that could compromise national security. One angry captain with a personal agenda barely registered as a threat. But Harper interpreted her calm as arrogance, her silence as an admission of guilt. In his mind, a legitimate soldier would be defending herself, protesting the accusations, demanding the respect due to her rank and record. Isabella's failure to react proved everything he had suspected about her. "Torres," Harper barked, his voice echoing across the desert training ground, "front and center." Isabella stepped forward without hesitation, her movements fluid and precise. She had been expecting this moment for days, had seen the signs building in Harper's increasingly hostile behavior and the coordinating glances between Pierce, Fields, and Nash. When you operated at the level Isabella had reached, you learned to read people like weather patterns, and the storm had been building for weeks. Harper began circling her slowly, like a predator establishing dominance over prey. "Tell me, Torres, what exactly qualifies you to be here among these elite soldiers? What have you done to earn the right to wear that uniform?" Isabella's response was measured, professional, and completely unsatisfying to Harper's desire for dramatic confrontation. "Sir, my service record speaks for itself." "Does it?" Harper's voice carried a note of triumph, as if her answer had proven his point.
because I've reviewed your file and there are some very interesting gaps in your documentation. Missions that can't be verified, assignments that don't appear in standard databases, credentials that seem to exist only on paper. Around the formation, soldiers leaned forward to catch every word. This was better than entertainment. This was the kind of drama that would be retold in mess halls for years. The quiet woman who had made everyone uncomfortable was finally being called to account for her mysterious background.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Harper was building to his crescendo, the moment he had been planning since his conversation with Pierce. I think you're a fraud, Torres. I think you've never seen real combat, never earned the qualifications you claim, never proven yourself worthy of the respect that genuine soldiers deserve. Isabella's breathing remained steady, her posture unchanged. She had maintained her cover for 3 weeks under increasingly hostile scrutiny, and she could maintain it for 3 more minutes while Harper worked through whatever demonstration he had planned. But I'm willing to give you a chance to prove me wrong, Harper continued, his voice carrying the false generosity of someone who believed they held all the advantages. Right here, right now, in front of everyone who has been questioning your legitimacy. He gestured toward a complex obstacle course that had been set up for the day's training. Complete the advanced tactical course, under full observation, with live ammunition, and time limits that would challenge our most experienced operators. The challenge was designed to be impossible for someone without genuine elite training. The course included elements that required years of specialized instruction to master safely: close-quarters combat scenarios, precision shooting under stress, complex decision-making under time pressure. Harper was betting that Isabella would either refuse the challenge, exposing her as a fraud, or attempt it and fail spectacularly, proving his point about her lack of genuine qualifications. But Harper had made one critical miscalculation. He had assumed that Isabella's mysterious background meant she was less qualified than she appeared, not more qualified than anyone could imagine. Isabella looked at the course, mentally cataloging each element, assessing the tactical requirements, calculating optimal approaches. It was complex, challenging, and dangerous. Exactly the kind of scenario she had been trained to handle by instructors whose names were classified at levels Harper couldn't even access. "And if I complete the course?" Isabella asked, her voice carrying a note that Harper couldn't quite identify. Harper smiled with the confidence of someone who believed he had already won. "Then I'll personally apologize for questioning your qualifications and recommend you to immediate advancement to our most elite programs." "And if I refuse?" Then you pack your gear and leave Fort Meridian today, with a notation in your file that you were unable to meet the performance standards required for continued service." Isabella nodded slowly, as if she was considering the fairness of the terms. Around her, hundreds of soldiers waited to see how she would respond to Harper's ultimatum. Cell phone cameras were recording every moment, ready to capture either her humiliation or her vindication. What none of them realized was that Isabella had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity, a legitimate reason to demonstrate capabilities that she had been carefully hiding for 3 weeks. Harper's challenge would give her official justification for revealing skills that would otherwise have blown her cover. Isabella said, "I accept your challenge, Captain," her voice carrying a new note of authority that made several experienced soldiers take notice. Harper's smile widened. In his mind, he had just won a decisive victory for military integrity and proper standards. Isabella Torres was about to be exposed as the fraud he had always known her to be, and his reputation as someone who could identify problems before they became disasters would be permanently established. But as Isabella began walking toward the starting position of the tactical course, Harper noticed something that should have warned him he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. Isabella's demeanor had changed subtly. Her movements carried a new kind of purpose, a predatory confidence that suggested someone who was no longer hiding their true capabilities. The quiet woman who had endured 3 weeks of mockery and suspicion was about to show everyone at Fort Meridian exactly who they had been underestimating. And Captain Harper was about to learn that sometimes when you demand proof of someone's capabilities, you get more than you bargained for.
Isabella Torres approached the starting line of the advanced tactical course with a stride that seemed to transform her entire presence. The quiet, unassuming woman who had been dismissed as weak and mysterious was moving with the predatory confidence of someone who had finally been given permission to stop pretending to be less than she was. Captain Harper stood at the observation point, surrounded by nearly every soldier and instructor at Fort Meridian. Word had spread through the facility like wildfire. The mysterious Torres was finally going to be put to the test, and everyone wanted to witness either her vindication or her spectacular failure. Cell phones were held high, recording what Harper was certain would be the definitive exposure of a fraud. The course itself was a nightmare of complexity, a series of interconnected challenges that would test every aspect of elite military training. It began with a precision shooting scenario that required hitting targets at various distances while moving through obstacles, progressed to a close-quarters combat simulation with multiple hostile targets, included a tactical climbing section that demanded both physical strength and technical skill, and concluded with a complex decision-making scenario under extreme time pressure. Harper had specifically designed the course to be impossible for anyone without years of specialized training. He had consulted with the facility's most experienced instructors to ensure that every element would challenge even their most elite graduates. In his mind, Torres would either refuse to attempt certain sections, exposing her lack of genuine qualifications, or she would attempt them and fail in ways that would prove his point about her fraudulent background. Isabella stood at the starting position, taking a moment to assess the course layout. Her eyes moved systematically across each obstacle, each target, each potential challenge. To the watching soldiers, it looked like she was nervous, maybe even intimidated by the complexity of what lay ahead. But experienced operators would have recognized what she was actually doing, conducting a tactical assessment, identifying optimal approaches, calculating risk factors and success probabilities. "Ready when you are, Torres," Harper called out, his voice carrying across the desert training ground with undisguised satisfaction. "Take all the time you need to prepare yourself." Isabella turned toward the observation area, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile or a nervous smile. It was the smile of someone who had been holding back for too long and was finally free to show their true capabilities. "No preparation necessary, sir," she replied, her voice carrying a new authority that made several experienced soldiers take notice. The starting signal came, and Isabella exploded into motion. She moved through the initial shooting gallery like water flowing around stones, her weapon tracking smoothly from target to target with mechanical precision. But it wasn't just her accuracy that caught everyone's attention. It was her movement. She moved through the obstacles without breaking stride, never slowing down, never hesitating, never showing the kind of cautious approach that characterized normal tactical movement. The first targets fell in rapid succession, headshots at distances that would challenge expert marksmen delivered while moving at full speed through terrain that should have made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Isabella's weapon handling was flawless, her reload times impossibly fast, her target acquisition so smooth it looked like she was following a predetermined script. Harper's confident expression began to show the first signs of uncertainty. Torres was performing better than he had expected, but there were much more challenging sections ahead. The shooting gallery was just the warm-up. The close quarters combat section should have been where Isabella's limitations became obvious. The scenario required engaging multiple targets in confined spaces while distinguishing between hostiles and civilians,
all while moving through rooms that had been specifically designed to create confusion and tactical ambiguity. Isabella entered the first room and immediately demonstrated capabilities that made the watching instructors exchange glances of disbelief. She moved like smoke, flowing from cover to cover with a fluid grace that suggested someone who had done this not in training, but in real combat situations where mistakes meant death. Her target identification was instantaneous, her fire discipline perfect, her tactical decision-making flawless. But what really caught everyone's attention was her use of advanced techniques that weren't taught in standard military training. She employed methods for room clearing and target engagement that were classified at levels most of the watching soldiers couldn't access. These weren't techniques you learn from manuals or standard military instruction. These were methods developed by the most elite units for the most dangerous operations.
Sergeant Pierce, who had been so confident in her assessment of Isabella's limitations, found herself staring in growing horror as Isabella demonstrated capabilities that far exceeded anything Pierce had seen in her own military career. This wasn't just confidence, this was mastery at a level that suggested years of the most elite training available. The tactical climbing section should have been where Isabella's physical limitations became apparent. The course required ascending a 40-foot wall with limited handholds while carrying full combat gear, then rappelling down the opposite side under simulated fire. Isabella approached the wall and began climbing with the kind of effortless efficiency that comes from muscle memory developed through countless repetitions under extreme conditions. She moved up the vertical surface like gravity was optional, her technique so perfect that experienced climbers in the watching crowd found themselves analyzing her methods for insights they could apply to their own training. At the top of the wall, Isabella paused for exactly 3 seconds to assess the rappelling setup, then descended in a controlled fall that brought her to the ground in half the time it would take most soldiers to complete the same maneuver safely. Harper's confidence was evaporating rapidly. Torres wasn't just completing the course, she was dominating it in ways that suggested capabilities far beyond what anyone had imagined. But the final section would surely expose whatever tricks she was using to create the illusion of elite competence. The concluding scenario was the most complex part of the course, a tactical decision-making exercise that required analyzing intelligence reports, identifying threats, and coordinating a response under extreme time pressure. It was designed to test not just physical capabilities, but the kind of strategic thinking that could only be developed through real-world experience in high-stakes situations. Isabella approached the scenario station and began reviewing the intelligence materials with the speed and efficiency of someone who had processed similar information countless times before. Her analysis was systematic, thorough, and incredibly fast. She identified threats that the course designers had buried in deliberately confusing intelligence reports, recognized tactical patterns that most soldiers would miss entirely, and formulated a response that demonstrated understanding of strategic principles that weren't taught below the highest levels of military education. When she finished the course, Isabella's time wasn't just impressive, it was record-breaking. She had completed every section faster than anyone in the facility's history while maintaining perfect scores across all evaluation criteria. But more importantly, she had demonstrated capabilities that suggested training and experience at levels that most of the watching soldiers had never encountered. The observation area had gone completely silent. Hundreds of soldiers who had gathered to watch Isabella's humiliation were now staring at someone who had just proven herself to be the most capable operator any of them had ever seen perform. Harper's face had gone pale. His carefully planned exposure of a fraud had instead revealed someone whose capabilities made his own accomplishments look insignificant by comparison. But worse than the professional embarrassment was the growing realization that he had just publicly challenged someone whose background was obviously classified far above his own clearance level. Isabella walked back to the observation area, her breathing barely elevated despite having just completed a course that would leave most elite soldiers exhausted. She stopped directly in front of Harper, her expression neutral, but her eyes carrying a quiet intensity that made him take an involuntary step backward. "Was my performance satisfactory, Captain?" she asked, her voice carrying just enough emphasis on his rank to remind everyone present of the chain of command.
But before Harper could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles broke the desert silence. Official cars were pulling up to the training area, black SUVs with government plates and tinted windows that suggested the arrival of people with authority levels that no one at Fort Meridian was prepared to challenge. The doors opened and men in dress uniforms stepped out. Their bearing and the deference shown to them by even the senior instructors made it clear that these were not routine visitors. As they approached the observation area, Isabella straightened to attention with a precision that suggested she knew exactly who these people were and why they had come. The lead figure was a man whose uniform bore stars that made every soldier in the area automatically straighten their posture. When he spoke, his voice carried the absolute authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Which one of you," he asked, his eyes scanning the crowd before settling on Harper, ordered a Silent Storm operative to demonstrate her capabilities in front of unauthorized personnel?
The words "Silent Storm operative" hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Even soldiers who had never heard the specific designation could sense from the immediate change in atmosphere that they had just learned something that carried implications far beyond their understanding. The senior officers present, colonels and majors who had spent decades in military service, went rigid with recognition and what appeared to be barely controlled panic. General Theodore Blackwood stepped forward with the kind of measured authority that comes from commanding operations that shape global security. At 62, his uniform displayed ribbons and commendations that represented conflicts most people would never hear about, decisions that had prevented wars from starting, and successes that would remain classified long after everyone present was dead. Captain Harper found himself the focus of Blackwood's attention, and every instinct developed through years of military service was screaming that he was in more trouble than he had ever imagined possible. Harper's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, his brain struggling to process the gap between what he thought he knew about Isabella Torres and the reality that was rapidly becoming apparent. "General Blackwood, sir," Harper finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know. The documentation didn't indicate. There was nothing in her file." Blackwood's expression suggested that Harper's ignorance was not going to serve as an adequate defense for what had just occurred. "Captain, you have just forced a Level 7 operative to reveal capabilities that are classified above your clearance level in front of personnel who lack the authorization to witness such demonstrations, while recording devices captured evidence of methods that are restricted under multiple sections of the National Defense Authorization Act." Each word landed with the weight of career-ending implications. Around the observation area, soldiers who had been recording Isabella's performance were quietly putting away their phones, suddenly aware that they might have inadvertently documented something that could result in serious legal consequences. Colonel Diana Stone, who had been watching the entire confrontation from the command post, approached the group with an expression that suggested she was calculating how much damage control would be required to contain this situation. Stone had spent 30 years managing classified personnel and operations, and she recognized the signs of a security breach that could have implications reaching to the highest levels of government. "Sir," Stone addressed General Blackwood, "I can have all recording devices confiscated and all personnel debriefed under standard security protocols within the hour." Blackwood nodded grimly. "Do it. And I want a complete review of how this operative's cover was compromised and who authorized her public exposure." Isabella had remained at attention throughout the exchange, but now she stepped forward with the fluid precision that had characterized all her movements. "Sir, permission to speak freely?" "Granted, Operative Torres." "The exposure was not unauthorized, sir. I accepted Captain Harper's challenge as a legitimate test of my operational readiness. My cover was maintained until the moment I chose to demonstrate my full capabilities." Blackwood's expression showed a grudging respect for Isabella's professionalism, but his focus remained on Harper. "Captain, are you aware of what Silent Storm operatives do?" Harper's face had gone from pale to ashen. He was beginning to understand that his attempt to expose a fraud instead had revealed someone whose background made his own military achievements look like children's games. "No, sir. I mean, not specifically, sir." Silent Storm operatives are deployed to situations where conventional military solutions have failed or are not feasible. They operate independently, often for months at a time, in environments where discovery means death
and failure means catastrophic consequences for national security. He gestured toward Isabella, who continued to stand at attention with the same composed expression she had maintained through 3 weeks of harassment and suspicion. Operative Torres has completed 7 classified missions over the past 4 years. Her success rate is 100%. Her operations have prevented 2 terrorist attacks on American soil, disrupted 3 international weapons trafficking networks, and neutralized threats that you will never read about in any newspaper. Harper felt his knees going weak as the full magnitude of his mistake became clear. He had publicly humiliated, challenged, and attempted to discredit someone whose actual military service record made him look like an amateur playing at soldier. But more relevant to your current situation, Blackwood continued, silent storm operatives carry special authority under Section 12 of the Defense Intelligence Authorization Act. When operating under cover, they answer directly to Pentagon-level command structure, regardless of local chain of command.
The implications hit Harper like a sledgehammer. Isabella Torres hadn't been some mysterious veteran trying to reintegrate into military service. She had been an active operative, operating undercover with authority that superseded his own and connections that reached to the highest levels of military command. "Sir," Harper said, his voice breaking slightly, "I had no way of knowing." "You had no way of knowing because you failed to ask the right questions," Blackwood interrupted. "You made assumptions based on appearances rather than conducting proper due diligence. You allowed personal prejudices to override professional judgment. And most critically, you exposed a classified operative because your ego was more important to you than operational security." Around the observation area, the soldiers who had participated in 3 weeks of mockery and harassment were beginning to understand that they had been systematically insulting someone whose actual background made their combined service records look insignificant. Sergeant Pierce had gone white as she realized that her complaints about Isabella's unfair advantages had been criticisms of someone who had earned those advantages through achievements that Pierce couldn't even comprehend. Corporal Nash, who had questioned Isabella's combat experience, was staring at someone who had seen more real combat in the past 4 years than most soldiers would encounter in entire careers. Lieutenant Fields, who had suggested that Isabella's perfect performance indicated cheating, was facing the reality that Isabella's performance had been perfect because she had been trained to standards that made normal military instruction look like basic education. Isabella finally spoke, her voice carrying a new authority that made everyone present straighten unconsciously. "General Blackwood, if I may, Captain Harper's actions, while misguided, have actually served a useful purpose." Blackwood raised an eyebrow, interested in hearing how this disaster could be interpreted as useful. "My cover assignment was to evaluate the effectiveness of current training protocols and identify weaknesses in personnel evaluation procedures. Captain Harper's failure to recognize qualified personnel based on appearance and demeanor highlights exactly the kind of operational blind spots that compromise mission effectiveness in real-world situations." Harper realized with growing horror that he hadn't just failed to recognize Isabella's qualifications, he had actually been under evaluation himself, and his performance had been catastrophically poor. "Additionally," Isabella said, "the response of other personnel to my presence has provided valuable data about unit cohesion, leadership decision-making under uncertainty, and the prevalence of bias in personnel assessment." Blackwood nodded slowly. "Are you suggesting that this entire situation was part of your operational parameters?" "Not specifically, sir, but adaptable to operational requirements. Captain Harper's challenge provided an opportunity to complete my evaluation objectives while maintaining operational security until the moment revelation became necessary." Harper felt the world spinning around him as he realized that Isabella had just demonstrated capabilities that went beyond physical and tactical skills. She had been conducting a psychological operation that exposed every weakness in his leadership, his judgment, and his personnel management abilities.
he had been playing checkers while she was playing chess at a level he couldn't even recognize. Blackwood turned his attention back to Harper, and his expression suggested that the conversation was about to move beyond professional embarrassment into career-ending consequences. Captain Harper, you are hereby relieved of your current duties pending a full investigation into your handling of classified personnel. You will report to my aide for immediate debriefing and reassignment. Harper's career was over. 35 years old, with what had been a promising trajectory toward senior leadership, and he had destroyed it all because he couldn't recognize competence when it was standing directly in front of him. But Isabella wasn't finished. She had one more demonstration that would complete her transformation from mysterious outsider to the most powerful person on the base. "General Blackwood," she said, "I believe this situation provides an excellent opportunity to implement the personnel evaluation reforms that were the primary objective of my assignment here. Proceed, Operative Torres." Isabella turned to face the assembled crowd of soldiers who had spent 3 weeks dismissing her as weak and unqualified. When she spoke, her voice carried the absolute authority of someone who had just been revealed as their superior in every measurable way. "Effective immediately, this facility will implement revised protocols for personnel evaluation, leadership assessment, and operational readiness determination. The methods currently in use have proven inadequate for identifying both capability and leadership potential." The quiet woman who had been mocked and marginalized was about to become the architect of a complete transformation in how Fort Meridian evaluated and developed military personnel. And everyone who had underestimated her was about to learn that the most dangerous people are often those who appeared the most harmless.
Isabella Torres stood before the assembled soldiers of Fort Meridian with an authority that seemed to transform the very air around her. The woman who had been dismissed as weak and mysterious for 3 weeks was now revealed as someone whose clearance level exceeded that of every person on the base, whose operational experience dwarfed their combined service records, and whose next words would reshape the careers of everyone present. General Blackwood stepped aside, his gesture clearly indicating that Isabella now held operational command of the situation. The symbolism was unmistakable. The highest-ranking officer present was deferring to someone who had been eating alone in the mess hall just hours earlier. "Before we proceed with immediate personnel actions," Isabella began, her voice carrying across the desert training ground with crisp precision, "I want everyone present to understand exactly what has been demonstrated here today." She gestured toward Captain Harper, who stood frozen in a state of professional shock that made him appear years older than he had that morning. Captain Harper's failure was not simply a matter of poor judgment. It was a systematic breakdown of the evaluation processes that this facility uses to assess personnel capability and leadership potential. Harper tried to speak, perhaps to offer some defense or explanation, but Isabella continued without acknowledging his attempt to interrupt. "For 3 weeks, I presented clear indicators of advanced training and operational experience. My performance metrics were consistently superior. My tactical knowledge exceeded standard parameters. My equipment maintenance and physical conditioning were obviously the result of elite-level instruction. Yet rather than investigating these indicators properly, personnel at this facility chose to explain my capabilities through assumptions about fraud, favoritism, or cheating." Sergeant Pierce felt a chill of recognition as Isabella's words hit home. Every criticism Pierce had made, every conspiracy theory she had entertained, every moment of resentment she had felt toward Isabella's superior performance was being revealed as evidence of her own professional inadequacy. Isabella turned her attention to the broader crowd. This represents a critical failure in military intelligence assessment. In combat situations, the inability to accurately evaluate personnel capabilities, whether friendly or hostile, results in catastrophic mission failure and unnecessary casualties.
Lieutenant Fields found herself remembering every conversation where she had questioned Isabella's background, every moment where she had assumed that superior performance indicated cheating rather than genuine competence. The humiliation was so complete that Fields felt physically sick. "Corporal Nash," Isabella said, her voice cutting through the desert air like a blade. Nash straightened involuntarily, his face pale with the realization that he was about to be personally addressed by someone whose operational background made his own service record look like a training exercise. "You questioned my combat experience based on your assessment that my technique was too rehearsed. Your evaluation suggests that you believe real combat experience should result in sloppy, improvised responses rather than precise, automatic reactions developed through extensive training and practical application." Nash opened his mouth to respond, but no sound emerged. He was facing the reality that his understanding of what combat experience looked like was so fundamentally flawed that he couldn't recognize the genuine article when it was demonstrated in front of him. Isabella continued her systematic dismantling of the assumptions that had guided 3 weeks of harassment and mockery. This represents exactly the kind of evaluation failure that compromises operational effectiveness in real-world situations. She moved on to Sergeant Pierce, whose confident criticisms now seemed pathetically naive in retrospect. "Sergeant Pierce, you filed formal complaints about what you perceived as unfair advantages in my performance evaluations. Your documentation suggests that you believe superior capability represents a deviation from normal standards rather than an example of what those standards should actually achieve." Pierce felt her career prospects evaporating as she realized that her complaints had been preserved in official documentation that would now be reviewed by people whose authority extended far beyond Fort Meridian. "Your failure to recognize genuine competence, combined with your active efforts to undermine a superior operative, demonstrates exactly the kind of leadership inadequacy that this facility's evaluation processes failed to identify and correct." Isabella turned back to Harper, whose face had gone from pale to gray as the full scope of his career destruction became apparent. "Captain Harper, your systematic documentation of concerns about my background represents a masterclass in how personal bias can override professional judgment."
She pulled out a folder that Harper recognized with growing horror. It was his own file of observations and complaints about Isabella's performance and background. "Your notes reveal that you interpreted every indicator of superior capability as evidence of fraud or deception. You documented my perfect performance as suspicious rather than exemplary. You treated my operational security protocols as antisocial behavior rather than professional discipline." Harper realized that Isabella had been aware of his investigation from the beginning, had known about his conversations with Pierce and Fields, had been monitoring his efforts to build a case against her while she was actually building a case against him. "Most critically," Isabella continued, "when you discovered gaps in my documentation that should have triggered proper security protocols and classified personnel verification procedures, you chose to pursue public confrontation rather than following established procedures for handling potentially classified personnel." General Blackwood stepped forward at this point, his expression grim. "Captain Harper, your handling of this situation represents multiple violations of security protocols, failure to follow established procedures for classified personnel, and gross negligence in operational security management." Harper's knees buckled slightly as he realized that his career wasn't just over, he was facing potential criminal charges for security violations. But Isabella wasn't finished demonstrating the completeness of her transformation from outsider to authority figure. She pulled out an official-looking document bearing seals and signatures that made Colonel Stone's eyes widen with recognition. "By authority of the Special Operations Command and the Defense Intelligence Agency," Isabella announced, "I am hereby assuming operational oversight of personnel evaluation and training protocol development at this facility." The document she held bore the signatures of officials whose authority extended to the highest levels of military command. This wasn't just a field promotion or temporary assignment. This was a fundamental shift in the facility's command structure that placed Isabella in a position of authority over people who had been mocking her hours earlier. Effective immediately, all personnel evaluations conducted over the past 3 weeks are hereby invalidated and will be redone using revised protocols that emphasize capability recognition over appearance-based assumptions. Sergeant Pierce realized that her perfect evaluation scores were about to be replaced with assessments that would reflect her failure to recognize genuine competence and her active participation in undermining a superior operative. Additionally, all personnel who participated in harassment, discrimination, or deliberate undermining of classified operations will be subject to review for continuation in this program. Corporal Nash felt his future in the military evaporating as he understood that his mockery of Isabella had actually been harassment of a federal operative conducting classified evaluation operations. Lieutenant Fields, Sergeant Pierce, Corporal Nash, and Captain Harper, you will report for individual interviews beginning at 0800 tomorrow morning. These interviews will determine your fitness for continued service in programs requiring advanced security clearance and personnel evaluation responsibilities. The 4 soldiers who had been most vocal in their criticism and mockery of Isabella were now facing career-ending reviews conducted by the person they had been systematically undermining. But Isabella's most dramatic demonstration of her new authority was yet to come. She turned to address the entire assembled crowd, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had just been revealed to hold power that none of them had imagined. This facility will implement immediate changes to training protocols, evaluation procedures, and leadership development programs. These changes are based on operational requirements that have been developed through real-world mission experience and will be mandatory for all personnel. The woman who had been eating alone and training in isolation was now dictating policy changes that would affect everyone present. The transformation was so complete that many soldiers were still struggling to process what they were witnessing. Furthermore, Isabella announced, I will be personally reviewing the service records and evaluation histories of all personnel at this facility to identify patterns of bias, incompetence, or security inadequacy that may require corrective action. Every person present realized that their entire military career was about to be scrutinized by someone whose standards of competence had just been demonstrated to exceed anything they had previously encountered. The quiet observer had become the supreme authority, and the people who had dismissed her as weak were about to learn that their careers now depended on the judgment of someone they had systematically underestimated and mistreated.
The Arizona sun was setting behind the mountains surrounding Fort Meridian when the full scope of the consequences began to unfold. What had started as Captain Harper's attempt to expose a fraud had triggered a cascade of career destructions, security reviews, and institutional changes that would reshape military personnel evaluation across multiple branches of service. In the secure conference room of the base's administrative building, Isabella Torres sat across from a series of officials whose authority extended far beyond Fort Meridian. The aftermath of her exposure had drawn attention from levels of government that most military personnel would never encounter, and the decisions being made in that room would determine the fate of everyone who had participated in 3 weeks of systematic harassment. General Blackwood presided over the review with the methodical precision of someone who had spent decades managing situations where national security and individual careers intersected in complex ways. The documents spread across the conference table told a story of institutional failure that went far beyond the actions of a few misguided soldiers. The security implications alone are staggering, Blackwood announced to the assembled officials. A Level 7 operative was exposed to public scrutiny, forced to demonstrate classified capabilities, and subjected to harassment that could have compromised ongoing operations in multiple theaters. Colonel Diana Stone, who had been silent during most of the proceedings, finally spoke up. Sir, I take full responsibility for the failure to properly brief relevant personnel about Operative Torres's presence and authority level. Blackwood's expression suggested that Stone's acceptance of responsibility would not be sufficient to address the magnitude of the security breach. Colonel,
Your facility's procedures for handling classified personnel are so inadequate that they represent a systemic threat to operational security. This incident could have resulted in the exposure of ongoing operations that affect national security. Meanwhile, in separate rooms throughout the administrative building, the individual consequences were being determined through a series of interviews that would forever alter the careers of everyone involved. Captain Harper sat in Interview Room A, facing a panel of officers whose combined authority could end his military career with a single decision. His service record, once impressive enough to suggest a path towards senior leadership, was now being dissected through the lens of his catastrophic failure in judgment. "Captain Harper," the lead interviewer began, "your documentation shows that you spent 3 weeks building a case against a classified operative without following any of the established protocols for verifying potentially sensitive personnel assignments." His defense attorney, a military lawyer who specialized in security violations, had advised him to accept responsibility and request clemency. But the magnitude of Harper's mistakes made any defense nearly impossible. "Sir, I believed I was protecting the integrity of the program," Harper replied, his voice carrying none of the confidence that had characterized his public challenge to Isabella. The documentation gaps in her file suggested irregularities that required investigation. His interviewer consulted Harper's own notes, which had been confiscated as evidence. "Your investigation consisted of systematic surveillance, coordination with subordinates to build harassment campaigns, and, ultimately, forcing a public demonstration that exposed classified capabilities to unauthorized personnel." Harper realized that his own meticulous documentation was now being used as evidence of his systematic violation of security protocols. Every note he had taken, every conversation he had recorded, every observation he had made was proof of his failure to follow proper procedures. Additionally, the interviewer continued, "Your failure to recognize the obvious indicators of elite training suggest fundamental inadequacies in your assessment capabilities that make you unsuitable for positions requiring personnel evaluation." Harper's career was over. The interview was merely a formality to determine whether his violations warranted criminal prosecution or simply administrative discharge. In Interview Room B, Sergeant Pierce faced her own reckoning. Her formal complaints about Isabella's performance were being reviewed by officers who now understood exactly what capabilities Pierce had been dismissing as suspicious. "Sergeant Pierce, your formal complaints about Operative Torres suggest that you interpreted superior performance as evidence of cheating rather than an example of genuine competence," her interviewer noted. "This represents exactly the kind of evaluation failure that compromises unit effectiveness in combat situations." Pierce had spent the previous night reviewing every interaction she had with Isabella, trying to understand how she had so completely misjudged someone whose qualifications exceeded her own by orders of magnitude. The humiliation was so complete that Pierce could barely speak.
"Ma'am, I realize now that my assessments were based on incomplete information and personal bias," Pierce admitted. "I failed to recognize genuine capability and instead assumed that superior performance indicated some form of deception." The interviewer made notes that Pierce recognized would determine whether she would be allowed to continue in military service at all. "Your failure to recognize competence, combined with your active efforts to undermine a superior operative, suggests fundamental problems with your judgment and leadership potential." Corporal Nash's interview was even more devastating. His aggressive masculinity and confidence in his own assessment abilities were being systematically dismantled by officers who now knew exactly how wrong he had been about everything. "Corporal Nash, you publicly questioned the combat experience of an operative who has completed 7 classified missions with a 100% success rate," his interviewer observed. "Your assessment that her technique was too rehearsed suggests that you mistake panic responses for authenticity and precision for evidence of fraud. Nash's understanding of what real combat experience looked like had been so fundamentally flawed that he couldn't recognize the genuine article when it was demonstrated in front of him. His military education had prepared him to identify competence in theory, but he had proven incapable of recognizing it in practice. "Sir, I realize that my evaluations were based on superficial observations and personal assumptions," Nash replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I failed to understand that superior capability should be recognized and respected rather than questioned and undermined." Lieutenant Fields faced perhaps the most damaging interview of all because her position as an officer made her failure to recognize and protect a superior operative a more serious violation of military protocol. Lieutenant Fields, as a commissioned officer, you had specific responsibilities to ensure proper treatment of all personnel under your observation, her interviewer noted. Your participation in harassment campaigns against a classified operative represents a fundamental failure of leadership and judgment. Fields had spent her career believing that she understood military hierarchy and proper personnel evaluation. The discovery that she had been systematically mistreating someone whose authority exceeded her own by multiple levels was devastating to her self-perception and her professional future. "Ma'am, I failed to fulfill my responsibilities as an officer and as a soldier. I allowed personal bias and group dynamics to override my professional judgment, and I participated in behavior that was completely inappropriate regardless of the personnel involved." But the individual consequences were only part of the institutional changes that Isabella's exposure had triggered. In the main conference room, decisions were being made that would reshape how the military identified, evaluated, and protected classified personnel across all branches of service. "Effective immediately," General Blackwood announced, "all military training facilities will implement revised protocols for handling personnel with potentially classified backgrounds. These protocols will emphasize proper verification procedures and protection of operational security over administrative convenience." Colonel Stone realized that her facility was about to become a test case for military-wide changes in personnel management, and that her own career prospects would depend on successfully implementing reforms designed by someone she had failed to properly protect. Additionally, Blackwood continued, Operative Torres will be tasked with developing and implementing training programs designed to improve personnel evaluation capabilities across multiple levels of military leadership. Isabella had not only survived 3 weeks of systematic harassment, she had transformed that harassment into a mandate for comprehensive reform of military personnel evaluation procedures. The woman who had been dismissed as weak was now tasked with training military leaders how to recognize competence, evaluate capability, and protect classified personnel. The people who had questioned her qualifications were about to learn evaluation techniques developed by someone whose standards of competence they had proven incapable of recognizing. By the end of the day, Captain Harper had been relieved of all duties pending discharge proceedings. Sergeant Pierce had been reassigned to a non-leadership position at a remote facility. Corporal Nash had been recommended for immediate separation from service. Lieutenant Fields was facing a reduction in rank and mandatory retraining in personnel evaluation procedures. But Isabella Torres, the quiet woman who ate alone and trained in isolation, was preparing to reshape how the most powerful military in the world identified and developed its most capable personnel. The transformation was complete, and the consequences would ripple through military institutions for years to come. 6 months after the incident that became known throughout military circles as the Fort Meridian exposure, Isabella Torres stood before a congressional subcommittee presenting data that would fundamentally reshape how the United States military identified, evaluated, and developed its personnel. The quiet woman who had once eaten alone in a desert mess hall was now briefing lawmakers whose decisions affected global security policy. "The statistical analysis is unambiguous," Isabella reported to the assembled congressmen and military officials.
Facilities that have implemented the revised evaluation protocols show a 43% improvement in identifying high-potential personnel and a 67% reduction in leadership failures attributable to bias-based assessment errors. The numbers represented more than bureaucratic improvements. They represented lives saved, missions completed successfully, and the kind of operational effectiveness that could only be achieved when genuine competence was recognized regardless of how it was packaged. Representative Sarah Chen, the subcommittee chair, leaned forward with interest. Operative Torres, can you explain how these improvements translate to real-world operational effectiveness? Isabella's response drew on case studies that had been accumulating since her reforms were implemented across multiple training facilities. Ma'am, the traditional evaluation methods used at Fort Meridian and similar facilities were identifying leadership potential based on aggressive self-promotion and vocal confidence rather than actual capability. This resulted in promoting personnel whose leadership would fail under pressure while overlooking genuinely competent individuals who didn't fit traditional leadership stereotypes. The transformation at Fort Meridian itself had been dramatic and swift. Within weeks of Isabella's appointment as Director of Personnel Evaluation Reform, the facility had become a testing ground for revolutionary approaches to military assessment and development. The first change had been the elimination of evaluation criteria that favored appearance, vocal assertiveness, and traditional masculine displays of competence rather than actual capability. Isabella had replaced these criteria with practical assessments that measured actual capability under realistic conditions. The previous system was designed to identify people who looked like leaders rather than people who could actually lead. Isabella explained to a group of visiting military officials during one of the facility's reform demonstrations. Our revised protocols focus on decision-making under pressure, tactical innovation, and the ability to recognize and develop capability in others. The results had been immediate and measurable. Soldiers who had been overlooked under the previous system began excelling when evaluated based on actual performance rather than traditional presentation. Personnel who had advanced based on aggressive self-promotion were revealed to have significant gaps in practical leadership capability. One of the most significant changes was the implementation of blind evaluation protocols, where assessors evaluated performance without knowing the identity, background, or demographic characteristics of the personnel being assessed. This eliminated the unconscious biases that had led to Isabella's own systematic underestimation. When evaluators can't see who they're assessing, they're forced to focus on actual capability rather than their assumptions about what capability should look like. The new evaluation system had identified exceptional personnel who would never have been recognized under traditional methods. Quiet analysts whose strategic thinking exceeded that of more vocal colleagues, technical specialists whose innovations solved problems that traditional leaders couldn't even recognize, support personnel whose organizational capabilities enabled mission success in ways that weren't captured by conventional leadership metrics. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Isabella's reforms was the implementation of reverse evaluation protocols, where subordinates assess the leadership effectiveness of their superiors. This created accountability mechanisms that prevented the kind of toxic leadership that characterized Captain Harper's approach to personnel management. The traditional military hierarchy assumes that rank equals competence, but rank often reflects political navigation skills rather than actual leadership capability. Our reverse evaluation protocols ensure that leadership positions are held by people who can actually lead, as determined by the people being led. The cultural changes at Fort Meridian had been dramatic as the procedural ones. The casual harassment and dismissive treatment of non-traditional personnel had been replaced by a professional environment where competence was recognized and developed regardless of how it was packaged.
New personnel arriving at the facility found themselves in an environment where superior performance was celebrated rather than questioned, where mysterious backgrounds were properly investigated rather than dismissed, and where the quiet observers were often the most dangerous operatives in the room. The facility's new motto, prominently displayed in every building, captured the essence of Isabella's reforms. Capability over appearance, competence over confidence, results over rhetoric. Training programs throughout the military had adopted Isabella's methodologies for identifying hidden talent and developing underutilized personnel. The woman who had been systematically underestimated had created systems that would prevent similar mistakes from occurring in the future. The most significant discovery, Isabella reported to military leadership, is that our previous evaluation methods were not just missing exceptional personnel, they were actively promoting incompetent personnel whose primary skill was appearing competent to other incompetent evaluators. This insight had led to comprehensive reviews of leadership assignments across multiple branches of service, resulting in the identification of numerous commanders whose positions exceeded their actual capabilities. The reassignments and retraining programs that followed had improved operational effectiveness measurably. Isabella's reforms had also revolutionized how the military approached diversity and inclusion. Rather than focusing on demographic representation, the new protocols focused on capability recognition, which naturally resulted in more diverse leadership as previously overlooked talent was identified and developed. True diversity comes from recognizing capability wherever it exists, Isabella explained during a presentation to military academy instructors. When you evaluate people based on what they can do, rather than what they look like or how they present themselves, you discover that talent exists in forms you never expected. The international implications of Isabella's reforms had also been significant. Military allies had requested access to her evaluation protocols, recognizing that the ability to identify and develop genuine competence provided strategic advantages in an increasingly complex global security environment. Within a year of the Fort Meridian incident, Isabella's methodologies were being implemented by military organizations in 12 countries, creating a new standard for personnel evaluation that prioritized substance over style. But perhaps the most personally satisfying aspect of Isabella's transformation of military culture was the prevention of future incidents like her own experience. New protocols ensured that classified personnel operating undercover would be properly protected, that superior performance would be investigated rather than dismissed, and that the quiet professionals who often carried the heaviest operational burdens would be recognized and supported. The goal, Isabella explained to a gathering of military reform advocates, is to create institutional cultures where the most capable people can operate effectively, regardless of whether they fit traditional expectations. The enemy doesn't care if our best operatives look like stereotypical soldiers. They only care about results. The woman who had endured 3 weeks of systematic harassment had transformed that experience into comprehensive reforms that would protect countless others from similar treatment, while ensuring that military institutions could identify and develop their most capable personnel regardless of how that capability was packaged. Fort Meridian had become a model for military excellence, and Isabella Torres had become the architect of a new understanding of what real strength looked like in modern military service.
5 years after Captain Harper had demanded that Isabella Torres prove her qualifications in front of hundreds of witnesses, she stood in the same desert training ground where her career had been transformed from mysterious outsider to military reform pioneer. But this time, she was addressing a crowd of international military leaders who had come to study the evaluation protocols that now bore her name. The Torres method had become standard practice across NATO forces and beyond, fundamentally changing how military organizations identified, developed, and utilized their most capable personnel.
The quiet woman who had once eaten alone in the mess hall was now considered one of the most influential figures in modern military personnel development. The lesson we learned at Fort Meridian, Isabella told the assembled officers, is that institutional bias doesn't just overlook exceptional people, it actively promotes mediocrity while marginalizing excellence. The crowd included generals, admirals, and defense ministers whose decisions shaped global security policy. They had traveled from dozens of countries to understand how one incident of harassment had triggered reforms that improved military effectiveness across multiple continents. Colonel Marcus Webb, who had replaced Diana Stone as Fort Meridian's commanding officer, introduced Isabella with words that would have seemed impossible 5 years earlier. Ladies and gentlemen, Director Torres has transformed not just how we evaluate personnel, but how we understand the very nature of military competence and leadership. Isabella's official title was now Director of Global Personnel Excellence for the Department of Defense, a position created specifically to institutionalize the reforms that had emerged from her experience. Her authority extended across all branches of the U.S. military and included advisory roles with allied forces worldwide. The statistical evidence of her impact was overwhelming. Military units trained under Torres method protocols showed 40% lower casualty rates, 60% higher mission success rates, and dramatically improved ability to identify and develop leadership potential among previously overlooked personnel. But beyond the numbers was a cultural transformation that had redefined what strength looked like in military service. The aggressive posturing and vocal self-promotion that had once been mistaken for leadership capability had been replaced by emphasis on tactical innovation, team development, and results-oriented performance. Real strength, Isabella explained to the international audience, often appears quiet until the moment it's needed. The most dangerous operatives are frequently the ones who don't announce their capabilities until circumstances require demonstration. The audience sat officers who had implemented Isabella's protocols in their own military organizations, each with stories of previously overlooked personnel who had emerged as exceptional leaders once bias-based evaluation systems were eliminated. General Patricia Ramirez from the Spanish Armed Forces spoke during the Q&A session. Director Torres, your methods helped us identify our most effective Special Operations Commander, a woman who had been passed over for promotion 7 times because she didn't fit traditional leadership stereotypes. Under your evaluation protocols, her capabilities were immediately obvious. Similar stories had emerged from military organizations around the world. The Torres method had revealed hidden talent in every force that implemented it, demonstrating that exceptional capability existed in forms that traditional military culture had been systematically overlooking. Isabella's personal office at the Pentagon reflected her journey from outsider to institutional reformer. The walls displayed commendations from military organizations worldwide, photographs from training facilities across 6 continents, and a simple, framed picture that held special significance. The last photograph of her original Silent Storm team, taken before the Operation Ghost Viper mission that had changed everything. The 5 teammates I lost taught me that competence without recognition is not just a personal tragedy, it's an operational failure that costs lives, Isabella reflected during a private interview. Their sacrifice gave meaning to everything that followed. The reforms Isabella had implemented had prevented countless similar tragedies by ensuring that genuine capability was identified and developed regardless of how it was packaged. Military psychologists had documented a measurable decrease in the kind of leadership failures that resulted from promoting appearance over substance. But perhaps the most meaningful validation of Isabella's work was visible every day at Fort Meridian itself. The facility had become a destination for military personnel who didn't fit traditional molds but possessed exceptional capabilities. The quiet observers, the technical specialists, the unconventional thinkers who might have been marginalized elsewhere found themselves in an environment designed to recognize and develop their unique talents. Instructor Barnes, who had witnessed Isabella's original humiliation and transformation, now taught evaluation techniques to military assessors from around the world. Director Torres showed us that our job isn't to identify people who look like leaders, Barnes explained to a class of international officers. Our job is to identify people who can actually lead, regardless of what that looks like. The mess hall, where Isabella had once sat alone, now hosted regular meetings between personnel whose diverse backgrounds and unconventional approaches to military service would have made them outcasts under the old system. The culture of casual harassment and dismissive treatment had been replaced by professional environments where competence was celebrated in all its forms. The advanced tactical course where Isabella had demonstrated her capabilities had become a pilgrimage site of sorts for military reformers. A plaque marked the location where traditional assumptions about strength and competence had been shattered, triggering changes that improved military effectiveness worldwide. "This is where we learned that appearances can be fatally deceiving," the plaque read. "True strength reveals itself not in posturing, but in performance." Isabella's annual address to Fort Meridian personnel had become a highly anticipated event, broadcast to military installations worldwide. Her message remained consistent. The most dangerous mistake military organizations could make was underestimating people based on how they presented themselves, rather than what they could actually accomplish. Every person in uniform carries capabilities that may not be immediately obvious, Isabella told this year's audience. Our responsibility is to create environments where those capabilities can be recognized, developed, and utilized effectively. The enemy doesn't care if our best people look like traditional soldiers. They only care about results. The story of Isabella Torres had become required reading at military academies worldwide, taught as a case study in leadership, institutional bias, and the importance of recognizing competence regardless of its packaging. Her experience had been transformed from personal harassment into educational material that would shape military thinking for generations. As the sun set over Fort Meridian on the 5th anniversary of her transformation, Isabella reflected on the journey from mysterious outsider to institutional reformer. The woman who had been stripped of her uniform in disgrace had become the architect of evaluation systems that protected and developed millions of military personnel worldwide. The tattoo on her back, the silent storm insignia that had triggered her revelation, remained hidden beneath her uniform, but its meaning had spread throughout military culture. True strength often operated in silence until the moment came to change everything. The legacy of that desert afternoon when assumptions were shattered and careers were transformed would continue long after Isabella's own service ended. The Torres method would ensure that future generations of military personnel would be evaluated based on their capabilities rather than their conformity to traditional expectations. And somewhere in military installations around the world, quiet professionals whose competence exceeded their visibility were being recognized, developed, and empowered to achieve their full potential, all because one woman had been underestimated so dramatically that her vindication transformed an entire institution. The greatest victories, Isabella had learned, were often won not by those who announced their strength, but by those who earned the right to demonstrate it when the moment was right.